spoiled billionaire forced to marry his uncle's ugly daughter, but she drove him crazy in love. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. Jason Carter had always been a man who got everything he wanted. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the city, Jason had lived a life of luxury and privilege. Cars, mansions, private jets, you name it, he had it. His father's empire was one of the most successful in the country, and Jason was set to inherit it all. He had always been spoiled, used to people catering to his every whim. Yet, all of that was about to change. The phone call came unexpectedly one afternoon, as Jason was lounging by the pool of his estate, sipping on a cocktail. His uncle's lawyer had reached out with urgent news. Jason's uncle, the family patriarch, had passed away, leaving behind a will that would change Jason's life forever. The will stated that Jason must marry the daughter of his uncle, a woman named Melissa, in order to inherit the family fortune. There was one catch, though. Melissa wasn't just anyone. She was known to be, well, let's just say she wasn't what Jason would call a beauty. In fact, she was considered by many to be unattractive, awkward, and entirely out of place in his high society world. But Jason had no choice. He couldn't afford to lose the family wealth, not after everything he had been given his entire life. So, he reluctantly agreed to the marriage, seeing it as nothing more than a business transaction. When Jason first met Melissa, he was immediately struck by her plain appearance. Her dark brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore a simple dress that didn't fit in with the expensive suits and glamorous gowns of the social circles Jason was used to. She had an air of discomfort about her, as if she didn't belong in such a luxurious setting. Jason couldn't help but feel annoyed by her presence. How could someone like her, with no social grace or beauty, be part of his life? It felt like a cruel joke, but he held his tongue, focusing instead on the deal at hand. Melissa, on the other hand, was just as shocked as Jason. She had spent most of her life being overlooked and judged for her looks, never expecting to be forced into such a situation. She didn't want this marriage either, but she had no choice. Her family had been relying on Jason's wealth for years, and this union was the only way to ensure their future. As they exchanged awkward pleasantries, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was all wrong. He tried to keep his distance, but a small part of him felt bad for Melissa. She seemed so out of place in the grand mansion, like a fish out of water. And yet, there was something about her that intrigued him. Little did he know, this arranged marriage would soon become the beginning of a transformation that neither of them could have predicted. The first few days after the wedding were awkward to say the least. Jason and Melissa barely spoke to each other, only exchanging necessary words about their schedules and the running of the house. Jason was still angry at the circumstances that led to this marriage. He didn't want to be tied to someone like Melissa, a woman who was nothing like the glamorous women he was used to being around. She was awkward, unpolished, and didn't seem to care about the wealth and status that Jason took for granted. She didn't try to impress him with fancy clothes or try to engage him in conversations about business. She simply did her duties, staying in the background, just as Jason expected. He would come home after long days of meetings and events, and she would be there, taking care of the house in her own quiet way. There was a sense of detachment that Jason found almost refreshing, but it also frustrated him. How could someone like her, who seemed to lack the drive and confidence he admired in others, be so calm and unaffected by the wealth and power surrounding her? It wasn't like she wasn't aware of it. It was clear she had been raised in a world far removed from the one Jason was accustomed to, but her indifference to the life he lived made him feel uneasy. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Jason found himself walking into the living room of their shared mansion. He expected the usual silence, the same empty house he'd come home to every night. But that evening, as he walked in, he found Melissa sitting by the fireplace, a book in her lap. The warm light from the flames cast soft shadows on her face. Jason stood there for a moment, watching her. She was wearing an old sweater, one that looked like it had been worn for years, and a pair of simple jeans. There was no makeup, no effort to look presentable as the women in his world would have. She looked peaceful, serene in a way that was almost foreign to him. His thoughts were interrupted when she glanced up and noticed him standing there. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, and for the first time since the wedding, Jason felt like he saw her. She wasn't just the ugly girl he had been forced to marry. She was a person, someone with her own life, her own feelings. "Hey," she said softly, her voice almost tentative. "How was your day?" Jason was caught off guard by her question. How was his day? He hadn't been asked that in a long time. "It was fine," he replied shortly, though he felt a strange urge to say more, to explain all the things he had been dealing with. But he didn't. Instead, he shifted his weight, still standing awkwardly at the door. "What about you?" he asked, unsure of what he was really asking. "How was your day?" Melissa smiled again, a genuine smile that made something stir in Jason's chest, though he couldn't place what it was. "I spent some time in the garden," she said. "It's a good way to clear my mind." "The garden," Jason repeated. He hadn't even realized there was a garden. It was just another part of the house he never paid attention to. "Yeah," she said, her smile growing a little brighter. "It's quiet out there. I like it." Jason felt a strange pang of guilt. Here was Melissa, trying to find a bit of peace and beauty in a life that had been thrust upon her, while he had been focused on his own frustrations. She had accepted the situation far more gracefully than he had, and in that moment, he realized he had been nothing but self-centered since the wedding. He didn't know why, but something about her quiet presence and the way she spoke so calmly made him want to know more about her, to understand her better. He wanted to ask her about her life, about her past, but he didn't. Instead, he just nodded and turned to leave. But before he could take another step, Melissa called out to him. "Jason." "Yeah," he turned, surprised. "Do you want to have dinner together tonight?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. But there was something in her eyes that made Jason pause. It was such a simple request, but it caught him off guard. He realized, for the first time, that he hadn't really tried to get to know Melissa. They had been married for days now, but they were still strangers. "Sure," he said, surprising even himself. "I think I'd like that." The evening passed quietly. They sat at the table, eating the meal Melissa had prepared. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple pasta dish with a side of salad, but it was one of the best meals Jason had had in a while. The conversation was tentative at first, awkward even, but slowly they found a rhythm. They talked about their days, about little things, and for the first time, Jason realized how much he had underestimated her. Melissa wasn't the ugly girl he had assumed her to be. She was thoughtful, kind, and had a depth to her that intrigued him. She had been through hardships in her life, struggles that Jason could never relate to, and yet she carried herself with a quiet strength. As they finished their meal, Jason felt a shift. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. A small spark of curiosity, of something more. It was a feeling he couldn't quite put into words, but it was there. And as the evening wore on, Jason found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't as pointless as he had once thought. The days after their dinner together continued in a strange, almost delicate balance. Jason and Melissa hadn't exactly become close, but there was something different in the air now. Jason was no longer seeing her simply as the woman he had been forced to marry, the one he had assumed was too plain and out of place. He found himself looking at her differently. There was a quiet intelligence in her eyes, a certain grace in the way she carried herself. The awkwardness between them began to fade, replaced by the simplest form of companionship. They ate dinner together most nights, and although the conversations remained somewhat casual, Jason started to enjoy their time together. Melissa wasn't like the women he was used to. She didn't care about designer labels or luxury vacations. She didn't talk about social status or the latest trends. She was refreshingly honest and real, with a depth of understanding that Jason hadn't expected. She shared small bits of her life, pieces of her past, and Jason started to piece together who she really was. Melissa had grown up in a modest home, raised by parents who had worked hard to give her and her siblings a chance at a better life. She had always been the practical one, the responsible one. There was no room for vanity or excess in her world. Her family didn't have the luxury of keeping up appearances. They lived humbly, but they loved each other deeply. Jason found himself fascinated by her stories. They were so different from his own experiences of privilege. He had never known what it was like to worry about money, to feel like he wasn't enough, to struggle. Melissa had been through so much more than he had ever imagined, and somehow, it made her even more attractive in his eyes. One afternoon, as Jason was walking through the gardens, something caught his eye. There, sitting under the shade of an old oak tree, was Melissa, with a sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hand moving across the page in smooth, deliberate strokes. Jason hesitated for a moment, watching her. He had never seen this side of her before. He had known her as the quiet, hard-working woman who kept to herself, but this was different. She was focused, lost in her own world, and there was something incredibly captivating about it. As he approached her, Melissa looked up, startled, as if she hadn't noticed him coming. She quickly closed the sketchbook and smiled awkwardly. "Oh, Jason, I didn't see you there. What are you drawing?" he asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to show him, but then opened the sketchbook again. It was a drawing of the garden, the trees, and the flowers, but it wasn't just a simple sketch. It was full of life, of movement, of color. Jason couldn't help but be impressed. "Wow," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're really talented." Melissa blushed slightly, clearly not used to receiving praise. "It's just a hobby," she replied modestly. "I don't really show anyone." Jason sat down beside her, intrigued by the way she seemed to light up when talking about her art. "Why don't you show more people?" "You should. You have a gift." Melissa shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I don't know. I've never really thought it was important. It's just something I do to relax." Jason looked at her for a long moment, realizing that there was so much more to her than he had first thought. She wasn't just the ugly girl from the arranged marriage. She was a woman with her own passions, her own dreams. "You should definitely pursue it," Jason said, his voice sincere. "You deserve to be recognized for it." Melissa smiled, a little surprised by his encouragement. "Thanks, Jason. That means a lot." As the days passed, Jason found himself thinking about their conversation more than he expected. He had never thought much about art or the creative side of life. His world had always been one of business and success, numbers and figures, the kind of life where creativity wasn't given much weight. But now, after seeing Melissa in this new light, he couldn't help but feel like he had been missing something important all along. He had been so focused on the superficial things, wealth, status, appearance, that he hadn't even stopped to think about the deeper parts of life, the parts that truly made a person who they were. It wasn't just Melissa's art that had caught his attention. It was the way she approached life, the way she found beauty in simple things, in moments of stillness. It made him question everything he had believed in. Over the next few weeks, Jason began to open up more to Melissa, to let go of the walls he had built around himself. They spent more time together, going on walks in the garden, sitting by the fireplace, and having long conversations about life. Slowly, Jason realized that he was falling for her. He had never intended to fall in love with Melissa. He had entered this marriage with the sole purpose of securing his inheritance, but now, he couldn't help but feel something more for her. It was a slow burn, a gradual shift from resentment and indifference to admiration and affection. Melissa, too, began to change. She had never expected Jason to be anything other than cold and distant, but he was different now. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her. For the first time, she felt like someone cared about her for who she was, not just because she was married to him. As their connection grew stronger, so did their feelings for each other. The walls between them started to crumble, and what had started as a forced marriage began to feel like something much more real. Jason was no longer the spoiled billionaire he had once been. He was someone who had learned the true meaning of love, and it had all started with Melissa. The weeks continued to pass, and Jason and Melissa's connection grew stronger with every day. What had begun as a cold, transactional marriage was now transforming into something real, something Jason hadn't expected. He found himself looking forward to their quiet dinners together, to their walks in the garden, to the moments when they would share their thoughts with each other. For the first time in his life, Jason felt like he was seen for who he truly was. And it wasn't because of his wealth or status, but because of the woman he was slowly falling for. As they sat together one evening, Jason couldn't help but notice how different things had become between them. Melissa, once the uncomfortable and unsure woman, had grown into someone confident and comfortable in her own skin. She had her own interests now, her own passions, and Jason had become a part of that world. He no longer saw her as the ugly girl who had been forced into this marriage with him. He saw a woman who had strength, beauty, and an undeniable charm. It was one evening, after dinner, that Jason finally admitted to himself what he had been trying to ignore for so long. He was in love with Melissa. He didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing her as an obligation and started seeing her as his equal. She was no longer just his wife by name. She was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. But there was still a part of Jason that was afraid. He had spent his entire life building a persona of power and control, and here he was, falling for someone who had never cared about wealth or status. He wasn't sure if Melissa even felt the same way. They had grown closer, yes, but he wasn't certain where she stood. One evening, as they were walking through the garden, Jason finally worked up the courage to say what had been on his mind for weeks. "Melissa," he began, his voice hesitant, "I think I've fallen for you." Melissa stopped in her tracks, looking at him with wide eyes. She wasn't expecting this, not after everything they had been through. She had never imagined that this arranged marriage could turn into something like this. But as she looked into Jason's eyes, she realized that she had been feeling the same way. She had fallen for him, too, though she hadn't known how to express it. "Jason," she said softly, "I've felt the same. I didn't want to admit it, but I've been falling for you, too." Jason smiled, a feeling of relief washing over him. It was the first time he had heard those words from her, and they meant more than he could ever express. "I'm glad," he said simply. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the only sound being the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The tension that had lingered between them for so long had finally broken, replaced by something much more powerful, love. As the days passed, Jason and Melissa's relationship blossomed even further. They were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. They were a couple, partners in every sense of the word. They talked about their future, about the life they could build together. Melissa no longer saw herself as the ugly daughter of Jason's uncle, the one who had been forced into this marriage. She was his wife, his love, and she felt cherished in a way she had never imagined. But despite their growing closeness, Jason still had one lingering worry. He hadn't told Melissa everything about his past. The truth about his family, about how his father's empire was built, had always been a secret. He knew that if their relationship was going to be real, he couldn't keep hiding things from her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jason decided it was time. "Melissa, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I've never told you the full story about my family. My father's empire wasn't built through honest means. He was ruthless, and he made a lot of enemies along the way." Melissa looked at him, concerned but not afraid. She had always known there was more to Jason's story, and she appreciated his honesty. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. "It's complicated," Jason said, his voice laced with regret. "My father used questionable methods to build his fortune, and for a long time, I didn't care about how it was done, just that I would inherit it. But now, with you, everything feels different. I don't want to live that life anymore." Melissa took his hand, her touch comforting. "I don't care about your past, Jason. I care about who you are now, and I love you for who you are." Jason felt a surge of gratitude toward her. She didn't judge him for his past. She loved him for who he had become. It was more than he had ever hoped for. From that moment on, their bond grew even stronger. They weren't just a couple in name. They were a team, ready to face whatever the future held. As they stood together by the fire, Jason realized that his life had changed forever. It wasn't just about money or status anymore. It was about love, and for the first time, he was truly free. Days turned into weeks, and Jason and Melissa's life together continued to evolve. What had once been a marriage of obligation, of convenience, was now something far more meaningful. The connection between them had deepened, transforming into a relationship built on mutual respect, understanding, and, for Jason, something he hadn't anticipated, love. As the couple settled into their new life, Jason began to see a future with Melissa that he hadn't thought possible. They made plans for trips, spent more time in the garden, and enjoyed quiet evenings by the fire, talking about their hopes and dreams. It was a far cry from the cold, structured life he had led before. But despite the growing closeness between them, there was still a part of Jason that felt uneasy. He had never been one to share his personal life with others, especially his family. And yet, now that he had truly fallen in love with Melissa, he knew it was time for her to meet his parents. For weeks, Jason had been putting off the inevitable. His family was notorious for their criticism, their superficial views of the world. He had no doubt that they would disapprove of Melissa, not because of anything she had done, but simply because she wasn't the type of woman they expected him to marry. But despite his reservations, Jason knew that he couldn't keep running from his family forever. He needed to face them, especially now that he was ready to embrace this new chapter in his life. One afternoon, he sat down with Melissa in the garden, where they often shared their thoughts. "Melissa," Jason began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you. I've been avoiding it, but I think it's time for you to meet my family." Melissa looked at him, a slight frown crossing her face. She knew that meeting Jason's family wasn't going to be easy. She had heard the stories about them, their coldness, their expectations, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of judgment. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "I don't know if I'm ready to face them, Jason." Jason reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I want you to meet them. I want them to see you for who you really are. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm with you." Melissa's heart warmed at his words. She had never expected Jason to be so supportive. She had assumed that he, too, would be embarrassed by her, that he would want to hide her away from his family. But here he was, telling her that he was proud of her, that he wanted his family to see the woman he had fallen in love with. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it. For you." They set a date for the meeting, and as the day drew closer, Jason couldn't help but feel nervous. He had never been good at dealing with his family's expectations. His father, in particular, had always been critical of his choices, and Jason wasn't sure how he would react to Melissa. But he knew one thing for sure. He was willing to fight for her, no matter what. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jason and Melissa drove to his family's estate. As they pulled into the driveway, Jason felt a tight knot in his stomach. His family's mansion loomed ahead, its cold, imposing walls a reminder of everything he had spent so long trying to escape. When they entered the house, the tension was immediate. His mother greeted them with a stiff smile, her eyes scanning Melissa with a look that was hard to read. "Jason, darling," she said in her usual cold tone, "so nice to see you. And this must be your wife." Jason nodded, his hand still tightly holding Melissa's. "Yes, mother, this is Melissa." Melissa smiled politely, though she could feel the weight of his mother's gaze on her. It was as if she was being scrutinized, examined, as though she were some sort of experiment. Jason's father, a tall, imposing figure, entered the room next. His eyes narrowed as he took in Melissa's appearance, and Jason felt a rush of defensiveness on her behalf. "You've married her?" His father's voice was low, his tone skeptical. Jason stepped forward, trying to keep his calm. "Yes, father. I've married Melissa." The conversation that followed was strained, to say the least. His family asked questions that were more about Melissa's background than about their lives together. Where did she come from? What did her family do? Did she understand the responsibilities that came with being part of the Carter family? Jason could see the disapproval in their eyes, and it made his blood boil. But what surprised him most was how Melissa handled the situation. She didn't back down. She didn't apologize for who she was or where she came from. She answered every question with grace and poise, showing them that she was more than just the woman they had dismissed. "I may not have the fancy background you expected," Melissa said, her voice steady. "But I have something much more important. I have the love of your son, and that's all that matters." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. Jason's parents exchanged looks, but Jason didn't care. Melissa had stood up for herself and for him, and in that moment, Jason realized that she was everything he had ever wanted. The meeting didn't go as smoothly as Jason had hoped, but something shifted in him that day. He knew that he couldn't keep trying to live up to his family's expectations. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all his parents, tell him who he should love. As they left his family's home, Jason took Melissa's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You were incredible." Melissa smiled, a genuine smile, the kind that Jason had come to cherish. "I'm proud of us," she replied softly. "We're in this together." And as they drove away, Jason realized that the life he had once known, the one of privilege and expectations, was behind him. What mattered now was the life he had with Melissa, and that was all he needed. After the tense meeting with Jason's family, things began to settle into a new routine. Jason and Melissa found their way back to the life they had started to build, but the shadows of the past still lingered. Jason had finally come to terms with the fact that his family wouldn't fully accept Melissa anytime soon, but he was determined not to let it affect his growing love for her. For the first time, he was beginning to understand what it meant to choose someone for who they truly were, not based on their status or appearance. As the days passed, Jason noticed a subtle change in himself. He was no longer driven by the need to prove himself to anyone, least of all his family. Melissa had awakened something in him that he had buried for years, a desire to be genuine, to be honest, and to live his life according to his own values. He had always thought that success meant wealth, power, and influence, but now, he realized that success could also mean love, kindness, and living authentically. The bond between Jason and Melissa only deepened. They continued to spend time together, finding comfort in each other's company. Jason learned to appreciate the small things, like the way Melissa's laugh could fill a room, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her passions, or how she would always find time to help others, no matter how busy she was. She had a lightness about her that Jason admired. She wasn't weighed down by the expectations of the world. She simply lived in the moment. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Jason and Melissa were sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm summer night. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, and the sounds of crickets filled the air. Melissa was leaning against the railing, her gaze lost in the distance. Jason watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with affection. "You know," Jason began, his voice soft, "I never thought I'd be here, with you." Melissa turned to him, a curious smile playing on her lips. "Why is that?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jason paused for a moment, thinking carefully about his words. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I knew what was important in life. But you've changed everything for me. You've shown me that love is what really matters." Melissa's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected Jason to say something like that. His words were unexpected, but they touched her deeply. She had always seen herself as an outsider in this world, the woman who didn't fit the mold, the one who was never good enough. But now, Jason was telling her that she had changed his life in ways that were more meaningful than anything money or status could provide. "I've always known what I wanted," Melissa said, her voice steady. "But I never thought I could find someone who would truly see me for who I am. You've made me feel like I'm enough, Jason." Jason reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You are more than enough," he said, his voice firm but filled with tenderness. "You're everything I've been searching for." Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The world outside, the pressures of their families, the expectations, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the connection they shared. But just as they were beginning to embrace the peace they had found with each other, reality began to intrude once more. Jason's business dealings, which had always been a part of his life, were now starting to affect their relationship. Jason had been so focused on building his empire that he hadn't noticed how much he was neglecting the very thing that had become the most important to him, his relationship with Melissa. As he sat in his office one evening, looking over the financial reports, he realized that he had been so consumed with his business that he had forgotten to spend quality time with her. Melissa had always supported his work, but he knew she wasn't content to simply be a part of his world without being a true part of his life. She wanted more. She needed more. The next morning, Jason took a deep breath and made a decision. He was going to take a step back from the relentless drive for success that had always defined him. He needed to focus on what truly mattered, Melissa. So he made the call. He arranged for a break from the constant whirlwind of meetings and corporate obligations. It wasn't easy. His business was his life, after all, but he knew it was time to make a change. That afternoon, when Jason walked into the living room where Melissa was sitting, reading a book, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice. "Melissa," he said, his voice filled with determination, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I've been neglecting us. And you're right. I need to make more time for what matters." Melissa looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Jason, you don't have to do that. I understand how important your work is." But Jason shook his head. "No, I want to. I've realized that I've been chasing something that doesn't matter." What matters is being here with you, living the life we've built together. Melissa smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. I've always known that you had it in you, she said softly. Jason sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. I'm sorry for taking so long to figure it out, he said, his voice full of regret. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. As they sat together, the weight of the world seemed to lift off Jason's shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. He had made the choice to put love first, and he knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they could face them together. As the weeks passed, Jason and Melissa found a rhythm in their life together that felt natural. Their days were full of simple pleasures, long walks, shared meals, and conversations that ran late into the night. Jason had made the decision to step back from the business that had dominated his life for so long, and he was starting to realize just how much he had been missing. The more time he spent with Melissa, the more he understood that he had been living his life in the wrong way. His success, his wealth, the constant drive to climb higher, it had all been empty. It had taken meeting Melissa, falling in love with her, to understand that what truly mattered was the love and connection they shared. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were learning together. Melissa had always known the value of simplicity, of honesty, and of hard work. She had never been interested in wealth or status, and she had shown Jason that it was possible to live a life full of meaning without those things. But despite the peace they had found together, there were still moments when the ghosts of their pasts crept in. One of those moments came one evening when Jason received an unexpected phone call. It was his father's lawyer, requesting his presence at a family meeting. Jason felt a pang of anxiety in his chest. He hadn't seen his family in weeks, and he knew that this meeting was likely to be uncomfortable, if not worse. But he couldn't avoid it forever. Melissa, noticing the change in his demeanor, asked what was wrong. It's my family, Jason said, his voice tight. They want to meet with me. I'm not sure what it's about. Melissa gave him a reassuring smile. You've made progress with them. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. Jason took a deep breath. I don't know, Melissa. Every time I face them, it feels like I'm going back to the old me, the person I don't want to be anymore. Melissa squeezed his hand. But you're not that person anymore. You've changed. You're not alone in this. Jason smiled weakly. He knew she was right, but facing his family was still a daunting prospect. The next day, he arrived at the meeting with his parents, his heart pounding. The room was cold, just like he remembered. His father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. His mother, always the picture of composure, glanced up from her papers as Jason entered. Jason, she said, her voice as formal as ever. Please have a seat. Jason sat down, his hands clenched in his lap. What's this about? He asked, trying to keep his tone steady. His father looked at him for a long moment before speaking. We've been reviewing the family business, he said. There are some decisions that need to be made, and we need your input. Jason nodded, but he felt a sense of unease settle over him. He wasn't interested in the family business anymore, not in the way he used to be. He had moved on from that life, but his parents didn't seem to understand. I've made some changes in my life, Jason said, his voice firmer than he felt. I'm not the same person I was when I was part of this business. I don't want to be involved in the way I was before. His father's eyes narrowed. You still have responsibilities, Jason. Your future is tied to this company, whether you like it or not. Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach. My future is with Melissa, he said, the words coming out stronger than he expected. I've made my choice. I'm not going back to the way things were. His father's face hardened, and Jason could see the anger flickering in his eyes. You think you can just walk away from everything we've built? You think you can turn your back on the family? Jason's heart was racing, but he stood his ground. I'm not turning my back on anyone. I'm just choosing to live my life differently now. I don't want to be part of the business, and I don't want to play the role you've always wanted me to play. I'm happy with the life I've made with Melissa. There was a long silence in the room, and Jason could feel his father's frustration building. But then his mother spoke, her voice softer than it had been before. Jason, she said, her tone almost pleading, you've always been our pride and joy. But you've changed, and we don't know how to accept that. Jason looked at her, his heart heavy. He had always wanted to make them proud. But now, he realized, their approval wasn't what mattered most to him. What mattered was the life he had with Melissa, the life they were building together. I understand that you're disappointed, Jason said quietly. But I can't live my life trying to meet your expectations. I'm happy, finally. And that's all that matters. His father leaned back in his chair, his face hardening. If that's your choice, he said, his voice cold, then you'll have to make your own way. Don't expect us to support you any longer. Jason nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. I understand. As he left the meeting, he felt a mix of relief and sadness. He had made his decision, but it hadn't come without consequences. His family was no longer a part of his life in the way they once were, but he was at peace with that. When Jason returned home, he found Melissa waiting for him, her expression full of concern. How did it go? She asked. Jason smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. It wasn't easy, he said, but I told them the truth. I'm not going back to that life. I'm moving forward, with you. Melissa wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time in a long while, Jason felt truly free. He had made the hardest decision of his life, and now, with Melissa by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. After the meeting with his parents, Jason felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had made the hardest decision of his life, but as he walked through the door of their home, the anxiety that had clung to him for so long started to fade. Melissa was there, waiting for him, her face full of concern. How did it go? She asked, her voice soft but full of love. Jason smiled, though the smile was tinged with sadness. It wasn't easy, he said, his voice calm but heavy with the emotions he was still processing. But I told them the truth. I can't go back to that life. I'm choosing to move forward, with you. Melissa's face lit up with relief and pride. She walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him in a warm embrace. I'm proud of you, she whispered. You did the right thing. They stood there for a moment, holding each other, the world outside seeming to pause as they found solace in each other's arms. It had been a long journey, full of obstacles and doubts, but they had made it through together. Jason had chosen love over wealth, family expectations, and the pressures of a life that no longer suited him. And now, with Melissa by his side, he knew he had made the right choice. Over the next few weeks, their life together continued to settle into a rhythm that felt more and more natural. Jason had stepped back from the business, leaving behind the corporate world that had once defined him. Instead, he focused on his life with Melissa, the woman who had shown him what true happiness and fulfillment looked like. They spent their days exploring new hobbies, going on spontaneous trips, and simply enjoying each other's company. Melissa had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world, and now she had someone to share those dreams with. Jason, who had once been too focused on his work, found joy in the simplest moments, laughing over dinner, taking long walks in the park, and waking up beside Melissa each morning. As their bond grew stronger, so did their vision for the future. They talked about the possibility of starting a family, of building a life that was rich not with money, but with love, shared experiences, and memories. But even as their world seemed perfect, there was still a lingering fear in Jason's heart. His parents had not taken kindly to his decision to step away from the family business. And while he had chosen to live his life with Melissa, the reality of being disowned still weighed on him. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Jason sat down on the couch, deep in thought. Melissa, sensing his unease, sat beside him. What's on your mind? She asked, her hand resting gently on his. Jason took a deep breath before speaking. I don't know, he said, his voice soft but troubled. I know I made the right choice, but sometimes I wonder if I've completely ruined my relationship with my family. What if they never accept me again? Melissa looked at him, her expression tender and understanding. Jason, you've made your choice. You've chosen a life that's true to who you are. That's something to be proud of. And no matter what happens with your family, I'm here. We'll face it. Together. Jason's heart swelled with gratitude for her words. She had always been his rock, the one person who never doubted him, no matter what. He took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I don't deserve you, he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. You've given me more than I could ever ask for. Melissa smiled softly, her eyes sparkling with love. You deserve everything, Jason. And I'm lucky to be the one by your side. Over the next few months, Jason and Melissa continued to build the life they had always dreamed of. The pressure from his family began to fade, and although there were still occasional moments of tension, Jason knew that he was where he was meant to be. He had chosen love, and with Melissa, he had found everything he needed. As they sat together one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Jason turned to Melissa, his heart full. "I think we've created something beautiful," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "And I'm excited for everything that's ahead of us." Melissa smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Me too," she whispered. "Together, we can face anything." And in that moment, Jason realized that it wasn't the wealth, the business, or his family's approval that defined him. It was the love he had with Melissa, the life they were building together. That was enough. It would always be enough. The following months were some of the happiest Jason and Melissa had ever experienced. They continued to build their lives together, free from the weight of expectations that had once dictated Jason's every move. No longer consumed by the pressures of his family or his business, Jason was finally living a life that felt genuine, authentic, and full of love. The couple spent more time traveling, exploring new places, and sharing experiences they had always dreamed about. They went on weekend getaways to the coast, took long walks in the park, and spent quiet evenings at home, just enjoying each other's company. It was simple, but it was everything they had ever wanted. Melissa, too, had found a new sense of peace. The constant uncertainty of her past had given way to the stability and happiness she had found with Jason. They had built something together that neither of them could have predicted when their marriage had begun. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, sipping wine and watching the stars, Jason looked at Melissa with a soft smile. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd be this happy. Not like this." Melissa turned to him, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I used to think happiness came from achievements, from success, from having the most money or the most influence," Jason said, his voice steady but full of realization. "But now, I see that happiness is here. With you. This life, the way we've built it together, it's everything." Melissa smiled, her heart swelling at his words. "I feel the same way, Jason," she said. "We've come so far, and I'm so proud of everything we've built." As the weeks continued, Jason and Melissa grew even closer. They talked about everything, from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. They discussed their dreams of starting a family one day, of building a home together, and of creating a life that was as rich in love as it was in experiences. But even as their relationship blossomed, there were moments when the past still threatened to creep in. Jason's family, though distant, still had a way of making their presence known. One day, Jason received a letter from his father. It was the first communication from him since their last confrontation. As Jason read the letter, he felt a mix of emotions. His father had apologized for his harsh words and actions, but the apology was complicated by the fact that his father still expected him to return to the family business. The letter was polite, but it made it clear that Jason's decision to step away had been a source of tension, and there was a lingering sense of disappointment in his father's words. Jason sat down on the couch, the letter in his hands. Melissa walked in, noticing his somber expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to him. Jason handed her the letter without saying a word. Melissa read through it, her eyes scanning the words carefully. When she finished, she looked at him, her face soft with understanding. "What are you going to do?" she asked gently. Jason sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I don't know. I don't want to go back to that life, but I also don't want to completely cut ties with my family. It's complicated." Melissa took his hand in hers, her touch warm and comforting. "You've already made your choice, Jason. You've chosen us, chosen this life. Your family will have to understand that." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's hard. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to their expectations, and now, they want me to come back to the very thing that made me miserable." Melissa smiled, squeezing his hand. "You don't owe them anything. What matters now is what makes you happy. And I'm happy with you. You're enough, Jason. And I'll always be here, no matter what happens." Jason leaned in, kissing her forehead gently. "I'm glad I have you by my side," he whispered. Over the next few days, Jason wrestled with the decision. He knew what he had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. The weight of his family's expectations still loomed over him, but he couldn't let it control his life anymore. Finally, after much thought, he made the decision to write back to his father. He thanked him for the apology, but he made it clear that he was not going to return to the family business. He had chosen his own path, and it was with Melissa. The decision to cut ties, at least partially, was not an easy one, but it was necessary. Jason knew that he had to live for himself, for the future he was building with Melissa. When he sent the letter, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made his choice, and he was no longer bound by the expectations of others. That evening, as they sat together, Jason turned to Melissa. "I sent the letter," he said, his voice calm but filled with certainty. "I told them I'm not going back. I'm moving forward with you." Melissa smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "I'm proud of you, Jason. You've done the right thing." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision sinking in. But in that moment, Jason realized that he had made the right choice. The life he had been given, the life of privilege and expectation, no longer held any appeal. What mattered now was the life he was building with Melissa, the life of love, authenticity, and freedom. And with that realization, Jason knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As weeks turned into months, Jason and Melissa continued to carve out their life, embracing the simplicity and peace that had come with their decision to step away from the pressures of the past. Their days were no longer filled with the noise of expectations, but with the quiet joys of living authentically. The world outside their home seemed distant, and it felt as if they had found a small, peaceful corner of it where they could simply be. Despite all the happiness that surrounded them, there were still moments of doubt, moments when Jason couldn't help but wonder if he had truly made the right choice. The letter from his father, though a step in the right direction, had left a lingering uncertainty. Would his family ever truly understand? Would they ever accept him for who he had become, not who they wanted him to be? And more importantly, would his decision ever be enough for him to be truly at peace with himself? These questions gnawed at him, and one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jason found himself lost in thought. Melissa, sensing his unease, reached over and took his hand. "What's going on in that head of yours?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of concern. Jason turned to her, offering a small smile. "I just keep thinking about my family. I know I made the right decision, but sometimes it feels like they're still out there, judging me." Melissa squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "They may never understand, Jason. But that's not your burden to carry anymore. What matters is that you're here, with me, living a life that makes you happy. That's all that matters." Jason looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right, of course. He had spent so many years trying to meet the expectations of others, always living in the shadow of his family's ambitions. But now, for the first time, he was free. Free to make his own choices, free to build a future that was truly his. As if to drive home her point, Melissa added, "You've chosen a life with me, and that's what matters. I love you for who you are, not for what your family thinks you should be." Jason smiled, the uncertainty in his chest slowly fading. It wasn't easy, but he was learning to let go of the past, to embrace the life they were building together. They had come so far already, and he knew that they could face whatever came next. That night, they went to bed in each other's arms, the worries of the world slipping away in the comfort of their shared space. The next morning, as Jason prepared for the day ahead, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Melissa opened it to find a courier holding a package addressed to Jason. She handed it to him, and he tore open the envelope to reveal a letter from his father's lawyer. His heart sank as he read the contents. His father had left him an inheritance, a large sum of money, along with a letter expressing regret for his previous harsh words. Jason felt a sense of anger rise within him, mixed with a strange sense of guilt. He had walked away from everything, his family's fortune, their expectations, and yet here they were, offering him money, as though that could undo the rift between them. "What is it?" Melissa asked, sensing his change in mood. Jason handed her the letter without speaking, his fingers clenched around the edges. She read through it quietly, then looked up at him. "Are you going to take it?" she asked softly. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "It's like they think money can fix everything. But I've already made my choice. I don't want their money. I don't need it." Melissa nodded, her expression understanding. "You've built something so much more valuable than money, Jason. You've built a life with me, and that's worth more than anything." Jason looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and love flooding his heart. "I don't want to go back to that world. I'm happy with you, Melissa. That's all I need." Over the next few days, Jason made the decision to decline the inheritance. He called his father's lawyer, telling him that he had no interest in the money or the property. It was a difficult decision, but it felt like the final step in fully severing ties with the life he had once known. Jason had found something far more important than wealth or status. He had found peace, love, and a future with the woman he had come to adore. As he hung up the phone, he felt a deep sense of relief, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Melissa, who had been sitting quietly nearby, looked up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You did the right thing," she said. Jason nodded, his heart light. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm done looking back." With that, they moved forward, hand in hand, ready to face the future together. The road ahead was still unknown, but Jason knew that with Melissa by his side, he could face anything. They had already proven that they could overcome the obstacles life had thrown their way. Now, all that mattered was the love they shared and the life they were building together. As they sat together that night, watching the stars above, Jason realized that he had found everything he had ever wanted: peace, love, and the freedom to be himself. And with that, he knew he was finally home. Months passed since Jason made his decision to leave behind the expectations of his family. With each passing day, his life with Melissa continued to flourish, and the weight of his past life grew lighter. The couple settled into a peaceful routine, spending their days working together, enjoying each other's company, and cherishing the bond they had built. Jason had never felt more at peace. No longer trapped in a world defined by wealth, power, and family obligations, he was free to live his life according to his own values. He was no longer just the heir to a fortune. He was a man in love, a man who had chosen a path of authenticity, and one who knew that love was the true measure of success. But even in their newfound peace, life had a way of throwing challenges their way. One evening, as they were sitting at dinner, Jason's phone rang. It was an unknown number, and he hesitated before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice cautious. "Jason, this is Jack Miller, your father's lawyer," came the voice on the other end. Jason's stomach twisted at the mention of his father's name. He hadn't spoken to his father or anyone from his family in months, and the last thing he expected was for them to reach out. "We need to discuss your inheritance," Jack continued. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He had already made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with his father's fortune, but this call made it clear that the matter wasn't settled. He looked at Melissa, his face a mix of frustration and concern. "I'll handle it," he said, but his voice was tight. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, Jason ended the call and put the phone down with a heavy sigh. Melissa noticed his mood immediately. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Jason rubbed his forehead, trying to find the right words. "They're still pushing. My father's lawyer wants to discuss the inheritance again. It feels like they won't let go, no matter how many times I say I don't want anything from them." Melissa reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Jason, you've made your choice. You've already told them you don't want the money. They'll have to accept that eventually." Jason nodded, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He knew that his family's expectations were never going to go away, not completely. It was clear that they still saw him as part of their world, a world that he had turned his back on. But what hurt the most was how their efforts to pull him back into that life felt like a betrayal of everything he had fought for. He had made the decision to walk away from that life and to build something real with Melissa. He wasn't going to let them drag him back into the old world he had rejected. The next morning, after some deep thought, Jason called Jack Miller back, his mind made up. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice firm, "I've already made my decision. I don't want the inheritance. I don't want anything from my father. I'm done with that life." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Jack responded. "Jason, you do realize this is a significant amount of money, right? And the property, the businesses, the assets. This is everything your father has worked for. Are you sure you want to walk away from it all?" Jason took a deep breath, the weight of the question sinking in. "Yes, I'm sure," he said without hesitation. "I've made my peace with it. I've chosen my own path, and I'm not going to let money or legacy dictate my future anymore. I've found something that means so much more than any of that." There was a brief silence before Jack spoke again. "I understand, Jason, but if you're certain about this, you'll have to sign some papers to formally decline the inheritance. It'll all be taken care of. Jason nodded, even though Jack couldn't see him. Send me the paperwork. I'll sign it. The conversation ended shortly after, and Jason sat back in his chair, the weight of his decision still hanging in the air. But this time, he felt a sense of clarity. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Later that day, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Jason handed Melissa the papers from his father's lawyer. She read through them carefully before looking up at him, her eyes full of understanding. "You're really doing this," she said softly. Jason smiled, a look of peace settling over him. "Yes, I'm really doing this. I've realized that the life I've been chasing, it's not what I want anymore. I've got everything I need right here, with you." Melissa smiled back, her heart full. "I'm proud of you, Jason. I always knew you were capable of this. You've created a life that's yours, and that's something to be proud of." They sat together in silence for a moment, taking in the beauty of the world around them. Jason had walked away from everything he once thought he wanted, but in doing so, he had found something even more precious, a love that was real, a life that was his, and the freedom to be himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason realized that he had truly come home. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was for sure. He had everything he needed. And with Melissa by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next, together. As the months went by, Jason and Melissa found a new rhythm in their life together, one that was shaped not by wealth or obligation, but by love, choice, and the simplicity of being present in the moment. It had been nearly a year since Jason had walked away from his family's expectations, and though the road hadn't always been easy, the decision was beginning to feel more and more like the best one he had ever made. They had built a life full of quiet joy, traveling to places they had always wanted to visit, enjoying the little moments, and finding peace in the simple pleasures. The house they had created together was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary from the world, a place where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or interference. One evening, as Jason sat at the kitchen table working on some personal projects, Melissa walked in, holding a small box in her hands. "I've got something for you," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's this?" he asked, setting aside his papers. She smiled mischievously as she handed him the box. "Open it and find out." He took the box, gently peeling back the wrapping to reveal a small, vintage watch, a watch that had been passed down through Melissa's family for generations. It was simple yet elegant, its craftsmanship timeless. Jason looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Melissa, this is incredible. But why?" She sat down beside him, her smile softening. "It was my grandfather's. He gave it to me when I was younger, and I want you to have it. It's a reminder that no matter what happens, time is precious, and so are the moments we share." Jason's heart swelled as he took in her words. He had never been one to attach sentimental value to material things, but the gesture meant more to him than he could express. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Melissa reached out, gently taking his hand. "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just know that I believe in us, more than anything. I believe in the life we're building." The watch, small as it was, became a symbol of the new life Jason had found with Melissa. It reminded him every day that no matter what had happened in the past, he was on the right path now. And as he looked at it each morning, his heart would fill with a deep sense of gratitude. Over the following months, the couple continued to thrive. They found themselves planning for the future with renewed excitement. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room together, discussing the prospect of starting a family, Jason looked over at Melissa, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you ever think about kids?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with curiosity. Melissa smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the love they had built. "I think about it all the time. I've always wanted a family, but only when the time is right, when we're both ready." Jason nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. The idea of becoming a father, of having a family of their own, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. He had never been sure about what kind of father he would be, but now, with Melissa by his side, the possibility of raising a child together felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I think I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "Ready to take that step, with you." Melissa's eyes softened as she reached for his hand. "I'm ready too, Jason. I know we'll make amazing parents." Because we already make an amazing team. The thought of starting a family together was exciting, but it also brought a sense of responsibility that neither of them took lightly. They began making plans, discussing what kind of life they wanted to give their children, one filled with love, stability, and the freedom to follow their dreams, just as they had done. It wasn't about wealth or success anymore. It was about creating a home full of warmth and laughter. But just as their dreams for the future began to take shape, a shadow from Jason's past resurfaced. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Jason received a call. It was from an old business associate who had once been close to his family's empire. Jason had severed ties with everyone involved in the business, but the message was clear. His father's health was deteriorating, and the family was reaching out. The lawyer's voice on the other end was calm, but Jason could hear the underlying urgency. "Jason, we need to discuss some matters. Your father is very ill, and there are some things that need to be settled." Jason stood there, holding the phone in his hand, the weight of the situation sinking in. Melissa walked over, sensing the change in his demeanor. "What is it?" she asked softly. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's my father," he said quietly. "He's not well, and they want me to come back to settle some things." Melissa looked at him with concern, but there was also understanding in her eyes. "Jason, you've already made your decision. You don't owe them anything. But if you feel you need to go, I'll be right here with you." Jason's heart was heavy with the decision that lay before him. He had already made it clear that he wasn't going back to that life. But now, with his father's health declining, the situation was more complicated than ever. After a long silence, Jason finally spoke. "I think I need to go. For closure, if nothing else. I need to see him, to face it once and for all." Melissa nodded, her hand gently resting on his. "I understand. And whatever happens, we'll face it together." With that, Jason knew what he had to do. It wasn't about going back to the past. It was about closing that chapter once and for all, so he could continue to move forward with Melissa by his side, building the life they had always dreamed of. The drive to his family's estate was long, and the closer they got, the more Jason's heart raced. It had been months since he'd stepped foot in this part of his life, and while he was resolute in his decision to leave it behind, the weight of the past still hung heavily on him. As they pulled into the long, winding driveway that led to the mansion, Jason felt the familiar mix of dread and frustration flood over him. It wasn't just about his father's health. It was the reminder of everything he had walked away from, everything he had fought to escape. "You don't have to do this," Melissa said, her voice gentle but firm. She reached over and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I know, but I have to do this. For me. And for closure. I need to face this, no matter how hard it is." Melissa nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." He squeezed her hand in return, grateful for her unwavering support. When they arrived at the mansion, Jason felt a sense of familiarity, but it wasn't a comforting kind of familiarity. It was the kind of feeling that reminded him of the person he used to be, the person he didn't want to be anymore. The sprawling estate, the perfectly manicured gardens, the imposing stone facade, it all screamed wealth, power, and expectations. And yet, none of it mattered now. He had made his choice. He had built a life with Melissa that was rooted in love, not material things. They were greeted by the butler, who led them into the grand living room where Jason's parents were waiting. His father, still the imposing figure he had always been, was sitting in an armchair by the fireplace. His mother, as always, exuded an air of calm authority, though Jason could sense the tension between them. "Jason," his father said, his voice cold but not unfriendly. "It's good to see you." Jason nodded, his throat tight. "Father," he said simply. His mother stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's been a while," she said softly. "We're glad you could come." Jason didn't respond immediately. The words were stuck in his throat, and he didn't know how to begin. "I'm sorry to hear about Dad's health," Jason finally said, his voice strained. His father looked at him, the old glint of pride in his eyes. "It's nothing serious," he replied. "But I wanted to see you, to discuss some things." Jason sat down, trying to calm his racing heart. "What's this about?" he asked, looking from his father to his mother. "We've been going over the family business, Jason," his father said. "There are some matters that need to be settled." Your inheritance, the properties, the company. It's time for you to step up and take your place. The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. His father's words were almost identical to those from the past. The same expectations, the same pressure. It was as if nothing had changed. He glanced at Melissa, who was sitting quietly beside him, her hand resting on his. He could see the support in her eyes, and it gave him strength. "I'm not going back to that life," Jason said firmly. "I've made my decision. I walked away from the business, and I'm not coming back." His father's expression darkened. "You don't understand, Jason. This isn't just about the business. This is about your legacy, about keeping the family name intact. You can't just walk away." Jason took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I've already made my choice. I'm not interested in the business or the money. I don't need it. I've found something more important, something real." His father's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, Jason feared the old confrontation would return. But his mother intervened, her voice calm but filled with an underlying sadness. "We just want what's best for you, Jason. We want you to be part of this family, to carry on the legacy." Jason stood up, his voice steady but resolute. "I've already built my own legacy. I'm happy with the life I've created with Melissa. That's what matters now." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Jason could see the weight of his decision sinking in. His father, the man who had always expected so much from him, looked tired, older, perhaps, and a little defeated. Jason felt a pang of guilt, but it quickly faded. He had made his peace with his choices. "I'm sorry, but I can't go back to that world," Jason continued. "I won't let it define me anymore. I've made a life with Melissa, and that's what I'm focusing on. I love her, and that's all I need." His father's eyes softened slightly, but the harshness never completely left his face. "You're making a mistake, Jason. But it's your life. I can't stop you." Jason nodded, his heart heavy. He had always wanted his father's approval, but he knew now that it wasn't something he would ever get, not in the way he had hoped. The life he had left behind was gone, and he couldn't keep chasing something that no longer mattered. As they prepared to leave, Jason turned to his mother one last time. "I hope one day you understand," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I don't know if I ever will," she said softly. "But I hope you find what you're looking for, Jason." As they walked out of the mansion and back to the car, Jason felt a sense of finality wash over him. This chapter of his life was truly closed. He had made his choice, and though it wasn't easy, he knew it was the right one. Melissa, ever supportive, wrapped her arm around his as they drove away, her presence a reminder that the life they had built together was all that mattered now. The drive back from his family's estate was silent. Jason sat in the passenger seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap as he stared out the window. The finality of the meeting with his parents lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. He had expected it to feel different. He had thought that closing the door on that chapter of his life would bring a sense of freedom, but instead, it left him with a strange mixture of relief and regret. He could still feel the weight of his father's eyes on him, the words of disappointment hanging in the air, and his mother's resignation. It was as if, despite everything, they still couldn't truly understand his choices. But Jason knew deep down that he had made the right decision. As the car rolled through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was a quiet reassurance that he hadn't been sure of in the moment. But now, in the silence of the car, he knew he was at peace with where his life was heading. Melissa, sensing his thoughts, reached over and took his hand. "You did what you needed to do," she said softly, her voice a comforting balm to his restless mind. Jason turned to her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it doesn't make it any easier." She smiled gently. "I know it's hard, but you're not alone. I'm right here with you always." Her words grounded him, and for the first time since leaving his parents' home, Jason felt a sense of clarity. This life with Melissa was his. It was real, and it was all that mattered. The rest of it, the family, the fortune, the expectations, was behind him now, a part of the past he no longer needed to carry. As they arrived home, the house felt different. The familiar surroundings that had once seemed empty now felt full of possibility. Jason and Melissa had created something together, a life not defined by wealth or obligation, but by love and the freedom to make their own choices. It was a home that held their dreams, their hopes, and their shared future. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, Melissa turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Have you thought about what's next?" she asked, her voice light, but filled with curiosity. Jason looked at her, the weight of their conversation still fresh in his mind. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've come so far, but there's still more ahead. What do you want for the future?" "For us." Jason thought for a moment, his mind drifting to the future they could build together. The possibilities were endless now that they had broken free from the past. "I want everything with you," he said, his voice steady. "I want a future where we make our own rules, where we decide what's important. A family, a home, a life full of adventure. I want to build something real with you, not for anyone else, but for us." Melissa smiled, her eyes soft with love. "That sounds perfect," she said, leaning into him. "And whatever comes our way, we'll face it together." The idea of starting a family had always been in the back of Jason's mind, but now it felt like a tangible goal, something they could work toward together. It was a dream that no longer seemed out of reach, but a part of the life they were building side by side. As they talked into the night about their hopes and dreams, Jason felt a deep sense of connection, not only to Melissa, but to the life they were creating. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the future. He wasn't concerned with proving himself or living up to anyone's expectations. All he needed was the love he shared with Melissa and the life they were building. In the days that followed, Jason and Melissa began making plans. They researched places to travel, started discussing where they wanted to live in the long term, and talked about the kind of parents they wanted to be. They dreamed of a home filled with laughter, a family they could nurture, and a future they could shape together. It wasn't about what his parents had once wanted for him. It wasn't about the empire or the inheritance. It was about making a life that was their own, one built on the love and values they both shared. But as they made these plans, there was still one final piece of the puzzle that Jason needed to address. While he had walked away from the family business, and while he had made peace with his decision, there was still a sense of unfinished business when it came to his family. His father's illness had prompted the recent meetings, but there was still a part of Jason that felt like he hadn't said everything he needed to. He had taken the necessary steps to sever ties, but it was clear that some things remained unresolved in his heart. After much thought, Jason decided it was time to go back, but this time, it would be different. This time, he wouldn't be the son who had to live up to expectations. He would go as a man who had built his own path, someone who had found his own way, and he would finally face his family on his own terms. As the decision settled in, Jason turned to Melissa. "I think I need to go back, to make peace with it once and for all," he said, his voice calm but determined. Melissa nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "Whatever you need to do, I'm with you. But I know you're already at peace with where you are now." Jason smiled at her, his heart full of love. "I am, but I think it's time to close that chapter for good." With her support, Jason knew he could face whatever came next, and when the time was right, he would go back to his family, not as the man they once tried to mold, but as the man he had become. And with Melissa by his side, he knew he was ready to move forward, whatever the future held. Jason stood at the edge of the estate, the towering gates of his family's property looming ahead like a reminder of everything he had left behind. His mind raced with a mixture of emotions, dread, uncertainty, and something else he couldn't quite place. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of change, and now, standing here once again, he felt a strange sense of resolve. It wasn't about going back to the life he had walked away from, but about confronting it head-on, closing that chapter for good, and finally putting the past to rest. Melissa stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm, offering silent support. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. His family was never going to accept his choices fully, but this was something he needed to do for himself. "You ready?" Melissa asked softly, her voice full of understanding. Jason took a deep breath, looking down at her, and smiled. "I think so." With that, they walked toward the gates, Jason's heart pounding with each step. The house loomed in the distance, its majestic exterior just as imposing as he remembered. It had been so long since he had walked these halls, and yet it felt strangely familiar, too familiar, in fact. This place was a part of him, but it was a part he had fought to leave behind. As they entered the house, Jason felt the eyes of the staff on him, the same cold, respectful gaze he had grown up with. He had always been the heir, the one everyone expected to follow in his father's footsteps. But that was no longer who he was. He was a man who had carved his own path, and today, he was going to make sure his family understood that. His parents were waiting for him in the same formal sitting room where they had spent countless hours discussing business, wealth, and expectations. The air was thick with the unspoken tension, but Jason wasn't here to engage in those old conversations. His father sat in the same leather chair, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. His mother stood by the window, her back to him, her hands clasped behind her. Jason, his father greeted him coolly, his voice lacking the warmth it once had. You came. I'm here, Jason replied, his voice steady. Melissa stood silently by his side, a quiet strength that Jason drew from as he faced the family he had distanced himself from. I know this isn't easy, his father continued, but there are still responsibilities that need to be handled. The company, the estate, it all falls to you now. Jason's chest tightened, but he pushed the feeling aside. He had heard this speech 1,000 times before, but today, it was different. Today, he wasn't the son looking to please. Today, he was a man ready to define his own future. I've made my choice, Jason said firmly, his gaze unwavering. I'm not taking over the company. I'm not going back to that life. You can't force me into it anymore. His father's jaw tightened, and Jason could see the frustration in his eyes. You think this is just about the company? It's about the family legacy, Jason. Everything we've built, it's yours. It's your responsibility. Jason shook his head, his heart beating faster. No, it's not. I've walked away from all of that, and I'm at peace with it. You might not understand that, but that's my truth. The room was silent for a long moment. His father stared at him, as though trying to read something in his face, while his mother remained still by the window, her expression unreadable. Jason felt a pang of regret for the life he had once hoped for with them, but it was fleeting. He had chosen a different life now. A life with Melissa. A life built on love, not legacy. I've spent my whole life chasing things that didn't matter, Jason said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I thought I needed this. He motioned to the house, to the business, to the empire his father had built. But what I needed was this. He reached for Melissa's hand, and as their fingers intertwined, he knew, without a doubt, that he had made the right choice. His father didn't speak at first. His mother's eyes softened, but there was still a distance between them that seemed impossible to bridge. So that's it then? His father asked, his voice low, almost resigned. You've decided to leave everything behind. Yes, Jason replied. I've decided to live my life on my own terms. And I won't apologize for that. I'm not the man you wanted me to be, but I'm the man I need to be. His father's face darkened, but there was something else in his eyes, something like a mix of pride and regret. It was the first time Jason had seen it. I don't agree with you, his father said slowly. But I can see that you've made your decision. I guess it's time for me to accept it. Jason nodded, the weight lifting from his shoulders. He had expected anger, perhaps even contempt, but instead, there was a grudging acceptance. Thank you, Jason said quietly, his voice soft but sincere. I know this is hard, but I'm not going back to that life. I'm moving forward with Melissa. There was a long silence, and then, for the first time in a long time, Jason's father stood up and walked toward him. He placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of acknowledgement. You've always been strong, Jason. I can't say I understand, but I can respect your decision. It wasn't the reconciliation Jason had hoped for, but it was enough. His father, in his own way, had given him the closure he needed. As they left the estate, Melissa by his side, Jason felt a sense of finality. The past was behind him, and with Melissa, he was ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they had built something real, something that no legacy or inheritance could ever replace. As they drove away, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror, Jason realized that his life was finally his own. And with Melissa by his side, he knew he was ready to embrace whatever came next. After their return from the family estate, Jason and Melissa were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the car sped down the road. Despite the sense of relief that had come with their final confrontation with his family, Jason couldn't help but feel like there was still a piece of him that hadn't fully healed. The door to his past had been closed, but the memories remained, lingering in the back of his mind. As they pulled into their driveway, the familiar feeling of home settled over him. It was a place where he had found peace, where he could be himself without the weight of expectations bearing down on him. They got out of the car, and Melissa took his hand, squeezing it gently as they walked toward the front door. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of concern. Jason stopped for a moment, looking out at their house, the home they had created together. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm okay. It's a lot to process, you know." Melissa nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "I know, but you've done it. You've faced your past, and now it's time to move forward." Jason smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "I'm lucky to have you by my side." As they settled into the quiet comfort of their home, Jason felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. The tension from his family's expectations, the pressure of living up to their legacy, it was all behind him now. He had made the decision to walk away from that life, and now he could finally focus on what mattered most, his life with Melissa. Over the next few days, the couple continued to settle into their new routine, enjoying each other's company and making plans for the future. They spent time working on projects together, talking about their dreams, and sharing simple moments that made them both feel grounded. Melissa's presence in his life had been a constant source of support, and Jason knew that he had made the right choice in choosing her. As they sat together one evening, discussing their future, Melissa brought up something they had both been thinking about but hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to start a family?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet hope. Jason paused, looking at her with a soft smile. "All the time," he said, his voice warm. "I've always imagined what it would be like, but now, with you, it feels like something we can actually make happen." Melissa's eyes lit up at his words. "I've always wanted that, too," she said. "A family, a home full of love. I want that with you." Jason took her hand, his heart swelling with affection. "I want that, too. I think it's the next step for us. But we'll take it slow, one step at a time. No rush." Melissa nodded, her smile widening. "One step at a time sounds perfect to me." As they continued to talk about their plans for the future, Jason felt a deep sense of peace. He had walked away from a world that no longer fit him, and in doing so, he had found something more valuable than any inheritance or legacy. He had found true love. And with Melissa by his side, he was ready to build the future they both dreamed of. But even as they made plans, there was still the lingering question of what would happen with the family business. Jason had severed ties with his family, but the empire his father had built was still very much in the world, and there were things that Jason needed to address. It wasn't about going back to that life, but about making sure that his past didn't haunt their future. After some thought, Jason decided to reach out to his lawyer to make sure that everything was in order and that there would be no lingering obligations or surprises down the road. He didn't want his past to come back and affect the life he was building with Melissa. The call was brief, but it gave Jason the reassurance he needed. Everything was in order. There were no strings attached to the inheritance, no lingering claims to the family business. It was over, once and for all. With that weight lifted, Jason felt like he could fully move forward. He didn't need anything from his past. His future was with Melissa, and that was all that mattered. A few weeks later, Jason and Melissa took a weekend trip to a quiet cabin by a lake, the perfect getaway to relax and focus on each other. The weekend was simple but meaningful: long walks in the woods, quiet evenings by the fire, and deep conversations about everything and nothing. It was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had built together. As they sat by the fire on their last night, Jason turned to Melissa, his heart full. "I never thought I would be here," he said softly. "I never imagined this kind of life. But now, I can't imagine anything else." Melissa smiled, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. "Me neither. This is everything I've always wanted." As they sat there together, the future felt bright. It wasn't about the wealth or the legacy that had once consumed Jason's life. It was about the love they shared and the life they were building, step by step. Jason knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it, with Melissa by his side. They had found their path together, and that was all that mattered. As Jason and Melissa returned from their getaway, a sense of calm settled over them. Their weekend at the lake had been a much-needed escape, a time to focus on each other and their future. But as much as they had enjoyed the peace and simplicity of the retreat, the real world awaited them. And Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to make one final decision to fully embrace the life he had chosen. His father's health had been deteriorating, and while Jason had already made peace with the business side of things, there was still a part of him that felt unsettled. Despite walking away from the company and family legacy, the unresolved feelings regarding his father lingered in his heart. He needed closure. Melissa, ever perceptive, noticed the change in his demeanor the moment they walked through the door. She had seen how much he had grown, how much he had changed since they had first gotten together. But the burden of his family was something she knew he would have to carry for as long as it remained unresolved. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" she asked softly, her voice full of understanding. Jason looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I thought I was done with it, but I can't help feeling like there's more I need to do. My father. I never really got to say what I needed to say." Melissa reached out, placing her hand on his. "You don't owe them anything, Jason. You've already made your decision. But I understand why you feel like this is something you need to close." Jason took a deep breath. "I know. I don't want to keep carrying this. I've moved on with you, but I need to face this one last time." Melissa smiled at him, her eyes full of affection. "I'm with you, no matter what." With her support, Jason knew he was ready to take the next step. The following morning, he called his father's lawyer to arrange a meeting. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to accomplish. Perhaps closure, or perhaps a final opportunity to speak his truth. Either way, he knew it was something he needed to do. Later that afternoon, they arrived at his family's estate once again. This time, however, it felt different. The house no longer held the same power over him. He was no longer the young man desperate to please, but a man who had forged his own path. As they entered the familiar halls, Jason could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. But it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of how far he had come. He and Melissa were led into the same room, where he had faced his family months earlier. His father sat in the same chair, his posture still rigid, but there was something different in his eyes this time. Perhaps the illness, or perhaps the realization that Jason was no longer the son he had hoped for. "Jason," his father said, his voice more subdued than it had been before. "I'm glad you came." Jason nodded, looking at his father for a long moment. He had come here expecting anger, disappointment, or even silence. But what he saw was something else, something that felt more like resignation than anything else. "I needed to come," Jason replied, his voice steady. "I've made my peace with everything, but I needed to say goodbye. To everything. To this life." His father's gaze faltered slightly, but he remained silent. Jason continued, his words coming more easily now. "I've walked away from the business. I've walked away from everything you and my mother wanted for me. And I'm not going back. I've built a new life, a life that's mine, with Melissa. And that's what matters now." The silence in the room was thick, and for a moment, Jason wasn't sure if his father would speak again. Finally, his father sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I never wanted to lose you, Jason," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've pushed you too hard, and I can see that now." Jason felt a pang of something he hadn't expected, regret, perhaps. "I didn't want to lose you, either," he said quietly. "But I couldn't keep living for you. I had to live for myself." There was a long pause before his father spoke again. "I don't understand it, but I've come to accept it. I may not have been the father you needed, but I never stopped loving you." Jason swallowed hard, the lump in his throat catching him off guard. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a step toward understanding. Jason realized that this was all he could expect from his father, an acknowledgement, however faint, of his decisions and the man he had become. He had spent so much of his life fighting to be something else, something his father wanted. But now he understood that he was never going to be that person. And that was okay. Melissa, who had been quietly standing by his side, took his hand, offering him silent support. "It's time to go," Jason said after a long silence. His father nodded, and Jason turned to leave. As they walked out of the estate, Jason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made peace with his past. The life he was building with Melissa was the one he was meant to have. They drove away from the estate, the familiar landscape passing by, and Jason realized that he was free. Free from the expectations of his family, free from the past that had held him captive for so long. He was ready to embrace the future with Melissa by his side. And as they left the past behind, Jason knew that the life they had created together was all that mattered now. As they drove away from the family estate, Jason's mind slowly began to settle. The silence that had filled the car was no longer heavy, but instead, it felt like the calm that comes after a storm has passed. He glanced over at Melissa, who was sitting quietly beside him, her hand gently resting on his. She had been his rock through it all, the turbulent past, the challenges with his family, and now, this new chapter. He wasn't sure what the future held, but with her by his side, he knew he was ready for anything. "I can't believe it's finally over," Jason said, his voice breaking the stillness. Melissa turned to him, her eyes soft and reassuring. "It's not really over, though, is it? It's just a new beginning." Jason smiled at her, the weight of the last few days still lingering but softened by her words. "I guess you're right. It feels like the last piece of the puzzle is finally in place." They spent the rest of the drive in comfortable silence, the quiet stretching out as they drove through the city. Jason wasn't sure how long it had been since he had felt this kind of peace, but it was a peace that felt earned, not given. The journey he had been on had been long and filled with difficult decisions, but now, at this point, he felt a sense of clarity he had never had before. When they arrived back at their home, Jason and Melissa both felt a sense of renewal. Their house, which had once felt like just a place to live, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could truly be themselves. They had made this life together, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team. Over the next few weeks, life continued to settle into a peaceful rhythm. They spent their days working on their individual projects, but always found time to connect. Jason had a renewed sense of purpose, his work now aligned with the values he had spent so long finding. He was no longer concerned with the idea of legacy or the weight of a family fortune. He had found something far more valuable: love and the freedom to live life on his own terms. Melissa, too, was thriving. She had never felt more fulfilled, her own passions blossoming in the freedom that came with building a life that was truly hers. They had started to talk more seriously about their future, about building a family, and what kind of parents they would be. The conversations, once filled with uncertainty, were now full of excitement and possibility. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Jason turned to Melissa. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," he began, his voice thoughtful. "About starting a family. I think I'm ready. I think we're ready." Melissa turned to him, her eyes lighting up with joy. "I'm so glad you feel that way," she said softly. "I've always wanted to start a family with you." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. "It's funny," he said, his voice a little lighter now. "I used to think I had to follow a certain path, the one my father wanted for me. But now, I realize that the path I'm on, the one I'm building with you, is the one that really matters." Melissa reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Jason. You've come such a long way." They sat in silence for a while, the setting sun casting a warm glow over them, as they shared a quiet moment of understanding. The decision to have a family was just one of many steps in their new life, but it was a big one. They both knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was, but they were ready to take it on together. Later that week, Jason decided to take one more step toward fully embracing his new life. He contacted a lawyer to finalize his departure from the family business, ensuring that no strings were left behind. It was a final gesture, an act of cutting ties with a past that no longer had any place in his future. When the paperwork was completed, Jason felt a deep sense of relief. He had finally closed the door on that chapter. There would be no more looking over his shoulder, no more wondering if he had made the right choice. This was his life now, and he had chosen it freely. In the weeks that followed, Jason and Melissa began to make more concrete plans for their future. They discussed moving to a new city, one that felt more aligned with the life they wanted to create. They dreamed of buying a home with a big garden, a place where they could raise their children, a place that felt like a true reflection of who they were. Jason still had moments of doubt, moments when the past tried to creep back into his mind, but he quickly reminded himself that he had built something better now. He was no longer bound by the expectations of his family, and he no longer needed their approval. The future was his to shape. One evening, as they sat at their kitchen table, reviewing some real estate listings, Jason looked at Melissa and smiled. "This is it, isn't it?" he said softly. This is the life we've always wanted. Melissa looked back at him, her face glowing with love. It is. And we're just getting started. Jason felt a surge of happiness, realizing that he had everything he needed right here, with Melissa by his side. The past was behind him, and the future stretched out before them, full of promise. They had created a life together, one filled with love, understanding, and the freedom to choose their own path. And for the first time in a long time, Jason was certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jason and Melissa sat together on their back porch, the evening air warm and peaceful. They had spent the past few weeks making plans for their future, deciding on a new city to settle in, looking at homes, and imagining the life they would build. The past seemed further and further behind them with each passing day. They had moved forward from the complications with Jason's family, and now they were focused on the life they were creating together. Jason had been feeling lighter, freer than he had in a long time. It wasn't just the physical space they had found in their new life, but the emotional space as well. He had let go of the past, his family's expectations, the inheritance, the weight of a life that wasn't truly his. And in doing so, he had found a peace that had eluded him for so long. Melissa had always been his anchor, the person who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, and now, he could see a future where they could both thrive. As they sipped their drinks, talking about the possibilities ahead, Jason realized just how much he had changed over the past year. He wasn't the man his family had wanted him to be, but he was finally comfortable in his own skin. He had walked away from a world that never truly fit him, and in doing so, he had discovered the freedom to be himself. I keep thinking about how far we've come, Jason said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. This time last year, I never imagined I would be here, with you, in this life. Melissa smiled, her eyes soft with affection. We've come a long way, but we're just getting started. It's amazing to think about all the possibilities we have ahead of us. Jason reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. I've never been this sure of anything in my life, he said, his voice steady. This is the life I've always wanted, but I didn't know how to get to it until now. Melissa squeezed his hand, her smile widening. I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard to get to this point. And now, it's all coming together. Jason looked out at the horizon, a quiet sense of contentment settling over him. It wasn't just about the new city or the house they would buy. It was about the foundation they were building, the partnership they had created. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. As the days passed, they began to make more concrete decisions about their future. They decided on a city, a place that felt right for both of them, a place where they could carve out a life. On their own terms. It was a big move, but it felt like the next step in their journey. They made plans to start looking for a home in the next few weeks, something cozy and welcoming, with plenty of space to grow into. The idea of building a home together, of creating a space that was truly theirs, was exciting. It was a new chapter, and it felt like the perfect time for it. In the midst of all their planning, Melissa brought up a topic they had discussed casually before, but had never fully explored, starting a family. Do you ever think about kids? She asked, her voice soft as she looked at him. Jason paused, considering the question. It had been on his mind for a while. But now, sitting here with Melissa, the idea felt more real. I do, he said finally. I think about it a lot. I've always wanted a family, and with you, I can't imagine anything better. Melissa's eyes sparkled at his words. I've always wanted that too, she said, her voice filled with hope. A family, a home. I think we'd make great parents. Jason smiled, his heart swelling with affection. We've talked about it before, but now it feels like the right time to start thinking seriously about it. They both fell into a comfortable silence, the idea of starting a family hanging in the air between them. It wasn't a decision they were going to rush into, but it was something they both knew they wanted for their future. For the first time, Jason felt completely ready for it. He had come a long way from the man he had once been, the man who was bound by the weight of family legacy and expectations. Now, with Melissa, he was ready to face the future and all that it held, with no regrets. They spent the next few weeks visiting the city they had chosen to move to, exploring neighborhoods, and getting a feel for what life might be like. It was exciting, but there was also a sense of stability in it. This was their next step. As they walked through the streets, hand in hand, Jason couldn't help but think about how far he had come, how far they had come together. He had built a life he was proud of, not because of the money or status that once defined him, but because of the love and support he had found with Melissa. It was a new beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. They found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, the perfect place to start their life together. It wasn't big or extravagant, but it had everything they needed. It felt like a home, a place where they could make memories, and where they could begin their family. When they stood in the living room of the house for the first time, looking out the window at the quiet street, Jason turned to Melissa with a smile. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet joy. "This is where our future begins." Melissa smiled back, her heart full of love for him and everything they had built. "I couldn't agree more." As they stood there together, Jason knew that this was the life he had always wanted, and it was finally his. With Melissa by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they had built something real, something lasting, and it was just the beginning. The months that followed were some of the happiest Jason and Melissa had ever experienced. They moved into their new home, a small, charming house nestled in a quiet neighborhood that they had both fallen in love with. It wasn't the luxurious estate that Jason had once been destined to inherit, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, with their love and their dreams. They spent countless weekends making it their own, painting walls, planting flowers in the garden, and organizing the space to reflect their personalities. There was no pressure, no expectations from anyone else. Only the joy of creating a home together. As they settled into their new life, Jason found himself looking at the world differently. He had shed the weight of his past and embraced a future that was built on his own terms. Every day, he woke up with a sense of gratitude, knowing that he was living the life he had always wanted. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past tried to creep back in. But with Melissa by his side, he knew they could face anything. Melissa, too, thrived in this new chapter. She had always been content with the simple things, but now, with a family and a home to call their own, she felt more fulfilled than ever. She loved the quiet mornings they spent together, sipping coffee on the porch and talking about everything and nothing. She loved the way Jason supported her, how he encouraged her to pursue her passions and dreams, just as she did for him. They were partners in every sense of the word, and the bond they shared only grew stronger with time. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Jason turned to Melissa with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what's next?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Melissa asked, turning to face him. "I mean, we've built this beautiful life together. We've talked about starting a family, and now we're settled into this home. But what's next for us? What do we want to do next?" Melissa smiled, her eyes warm and filled with love. "I think we've already started the next chapter," she said softly. "We've created something beautiful here, together. We've built a life based on love and trust, and I think that's all that matters. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to plan every step of the future. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to meet the expectations of others. But now, with Melissa, he realized that the best things in life were the ones that came naturally. As they talked into the night, Jason realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. The future was uncertain, and that was okay. What mattered was the present, the life they were building together, one step at a time. A few months later, Melissa discovered she was pregnant. The news was unexpected, but it brought them both an overwhelming sense of joy and anticipation. It was the beginning of the next chapter in their life, one they had both dreamed of but never fully realized until now. As they prepared for the arrival of their child, Jason felt a deep sense of purpose. He was going to be a father, and this new role filled him with both excitement and responsibility. He spent hours reading parenting books, preparing the nursery, and imagining what life would be like with a baby. He couldn't wait to meet their little one and to start the journey of parenthood with Melissa. The months flew by, and before they knew it, the day of the baby's arrival came. Jason was by Melissa's side every step of the way, supporting her through the labor and holding her hand as they welcomed their baby into the world. It was a moment of pure joy and love, a moment that changed everything. Holding their newborn child in his arms, Jason realized that all the struggles and challenges of the past had led him to this moment. He had made the right choice. He had walked away from a life that wasn't his, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. He had found love, a family, and a future. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, their baby asleep in the crib, Jason looked at Melissa with a smile. "We did it," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "We've built the life we always wanted." Melissa smiled back, her eyes glistening with happiness. "We did, and it's just the beginning." Jason held her hand, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. They had created a life together, one full of love, hope, and endless possibilities. And as they looked to the future, Jason knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, side by side, with no regrets and no looking back. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to shape. It was a new beginning, one that was theirs alone, and Jason couldn't imagine spending it with anyone else but Melissa. In this captivating story, we follow the journey of a young man who walks away from the life of a wealthy heir, seeking love, peace, and true happiness. His struggle with the pressures of his family's expectations leads to a profound transformation as he chooses a life rooted in authenticity rather than fortune. The story delves into the complexities of family, legacy, and personal growth, making it one of the most compelling millionaire stories you will come across. The narrative unfolds with a focus on personal choices, overcoming obstacles, and embracing a future built on love rather than wealth. Through the ups and downs, this millionaire story explores themes of self-discovery, the meaning of true success, and the power of love. As Jason faces the harsh realities of his family's rejection and chooses a new path, the story reveals that even the most affluent lives can be transformed when one dares to follow their heart. With moments of heartfelt emotion and inspiring resilience, this is a must-read for those interested in millionaire stories that go beyond money, exploring what truly makes a life rich and meaningful. Jason's story is a powerful reminder that real wealth is not about inheritance or status, but about finding fulfillment in love, purpose, and the courage to live authentically. As his relationship with Melissa deepens, and they begin to build their future together, this millionaire story shows that happiness often comes from the simplest of choices. The couple's journey towards starting a family and their commitment to each other highlights the true essence of wealth, the wealth of love and shared experiences. This heartwarming tale is a perfect addition to the collection of millionaire stories, proving that the most valuable treasures are the ones you create for yourself.